The Vietnam War still leaves a painful scar, both here in the United States and in Vietnam, as both countries have had to come to grips with the war's legacy and consequences. Today is April 29th, and April 29th happens to represent many significant events in the course of the Vietnam War, not the least of which was April 29th, 1975, the day that the last U.S. serviceman died in Vietnam. The last throes of the Vietnam War is just one of a surprising number of important historical events that occurred on this day in history. The U.S. involvement in the war in Vietnam began gradually and expanded into a 20-year struggle that Daniel Weiss, president and CEO of New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art, said last year, changed almost everything about how we live, what we believed, how we select governance, and how we think about the military. The date April 29th represents some of the gradual expansion of the war. We tend to see the war from the U.S. perspective, but of course there were others involved. Little recognized in the United States was the participation of Australia, a nation also profoundly affected by the conflict. Like the United States, Australian participation in the war expanded over time. In November of 1964, that growing conflict spurred the government to institute a draft, an action which began the first opposition to the war, a movement that would grow substantially over time into the greatest unrest in Australia since the institution of the draft during World War I. On April 29th, 1965, Australia took a major step in its participation in the war, as Prime Minister Robert Menzies announced. "We have decided, in close consultation with the government of the United States, to provide an infantry battalion for service in Vietnam." Menzies argued that a communist takeover of Vietnam would represent a direct military threat to Australia. In what was Australia's longest military commitment of the 20th century, the last Australian troops would not be withdrawn until 1973. Over the course of the conflict, some 60,000 Australian military personnel served in the conflict, nearly 3,000 of which were killed or wounded. The war saw an expansion on April 29, 1970, when troops from the Army of the Republic of Vietnam and the United States began operations across the border into Cambodia, an attempt to eliminate the threat posed by People's Army of Vietnam and Viet Cong forces operating in the border region. President Nixon publicly announced the action the next day. The success of the month-long campaign was limited and disputed, but it sparked outrage in the United States Congress, which moved to limit presidential authority to conduct war without the consent of Congress with the War Powers Act. The United States suspended its combat activities in Vietnam in 1973 amid the policy of Vietnamization of the conflict and following the signing of the Paris Peace Accords. But the conflict between the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, with U.S. aid, and the PAVN continued. Arvan resistance collapsed in the spring of 1975 as PAVN forces approached the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon on April 29th. A PAVN rocket attack killed 2 U.S. Marine Embassy guards, Charles McMahon and Darwin Lee Judge. They were the last 2 U.S. servicemen to die in Vietnam during the conflict. That day, the United States began Operation Frequent Wind, the evacuation of the remaining U.S. citizens, as well as thousands of at-risk Vietnamese civilians, from Saigon. The capital fell the next day, an event generally seen as representing the end of the war. Of course, Vietnam was not the only conflict that saw significant events on April 29th. Between 1337 and 1453, England and France fought a conflict over an English claim to the throne of France. In the spring of 1429, the English were at the height of their power in the 100 Years' War and besieged the nearly demoralized French city of Orleans. On April 29th, a young Frenchwoman who claimed to have been motivated by visions of the angel Saint Michael arrived in Orleans. Her arrival inspired the city's defenders, whose counterattacks compelled the English to withdraw from the siege. Joan of Arc's arrival in Orleans is seen by many to represent the turning point in the war. 158 years later, England was at war with Spain and under threat of invasion. On April 29, 1587, an English fleet under the command of Sir Francis Drake attacked elements of the Spanish fleet preparing for the invasion in the Spanish Bay of Cadiz. During a 3-day battle, the English fleet destroyed or captured some 40 Spanish ships and a great deal of the Spanish supplies, without the loss of a single English ship. It was the most destructive part of the raid that came to be known as the singeing of the King of Spain's beard, and delayed the attack of the Spanish Armada for at least a year. On April 29, 1862, after defeating Confederate coastal defenses, Union Admiral David Farragut entered the city of New Orleans with 250 Marines and brought down the Louisiana state flag over the city hall. The loss of what was arguably the Confederacy's most important port at the mouth of the Mississippi was a significant blow to the Confederate cause. If April 29th represented the end of the Vietnam War, likewise the date represents in many ways the end of the Second World War. The German Reich was in its last throes in the spring of 1945. On April 29th, the exhausted, demoralized German and fascist Italian forces fighting in Italy, almost completely out of supplies, signed the Peace of Caserta, signifying the end of Axis resistance in Italy. The peace took effect 2 days later. The same day, American forces liberated the concentration camp at Dachau outside Munich. While the liberation did not necessarily end suffering, an estimated 50 to 80 of the victims continued to die per day from disease and the effects of malnutrition, and another 1,000 died having been taken on a death march by camp guards to avoid the Americans. The liberation of one of the first and most notorious of Hitler's death camps symbolized the end of the horror called the Holocaust. Meanwhile, in Berlin, in a bunker in a city besieged by Soviet troops, the architect of that horror, Adolf Hitler, had come to realize that his fate was inevitable. On April 29th, he married his longtime consort, Eva Braun. The two would commit suicide the following day. At the same time, in the Pacific, the Allies were fighting the bloody Battle of Okinawa. On April 29th, the U.S. 307th Infantry was tasked with assaulting a heavily defended escarpment called the Mader Ridge. The website History on the Net describes the battle. The escarpment's steep cliffs and rocky outcrops became the backdrop for some of the most harrowing moments of the conflict. The struggle for control of this formidable terrain became a symbolic of the larger campaign to secure Okinawa and pave the way for an Allied victory. The bloody fight over just one ridge cost the Americans some 2,500 casualties, yet was little remembered in the context of the larger Battle of Okinawa until the fight was portrayed in a 2016 motion picture biopic of Army medic Desmond Doss, a conscientious objector whose actions saving lives on the brutal Hacksaw Ridge earned him the Medal of Honor. 1 year later, the war was over, and the Allies were seeking to hold the Japanese leadership accountable. While perhaps not as well known as the trials of Nazi leaders held at Nuremberg, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East was an attempt to establish accountability for the war in the Pacific that had resulted in, by conservative estimates, 25 million deaths. The IMTFE convened on April 29th, 1946. The trial would not be concluded until a final judgment of the court was read on December 4th, 1948. And perhaps as the final American coda to the deadliest war in world history, on April 29, 2004, the United States World War II Memorial on the Washington Mall was officially opened to the public. The memorial includes 56 pillars, each dedicated to the veterans of the United States states and territories, as well as a wall of 4,048 gold stars, each representing 100 Americans who died in the war. April 29th represents changes in world leadership. In China, in 1644, the peasant Li Zhizheng's rebel army captured and sacked the Ming capital of Beijing, compelling the Shenzhen emperor to commit suicide. Li Zhizheng proclaimed himself the emperor of the Shun dynasty on April 29th, marking the end of the nearly 3-century-long Ming dynasty. The kingdoms of England and Scotland had been under personal union since James VI of Scotland and the First of England had risen to the English throne in 1603, but many factors prevented the kingdoms from officially uniting until 1707. On April 29, 1707, the Parliaments of England and Scotland officially passed the Act of Union, which became official on May 1st, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain. The Kingdom of Ireland was added via the Act of Union in 1800, creating the United Kingdom, but there was always a desire for independence within Ireland itself. Demand for Irish independence grew during the Irish Revolutionary period, with the first armed uprising occurring around Easter, 1915. While the Six-Day Insurrection was defeated on April 29th, the Easter Rising set the stage for the Irish War for Independence, and eventually of the independence of the Republic of Ireland. Still, the United Kingdom lives on, illustrated by the wedding, on April 29, 2011, of Prince William, grandson of then Queen Elizabeth II, to Catherine Middleton. The couple are now the Prince and Princess of Wales. Much has been invented and created on April 29th. On April 29, 1769, patent number 913 was issued to Scottish inventor James Watt for the steam engine with separate condenser, a key technology of the Industrial Revolution. On April 29, 1913, Swedish-American electrical engineer Gideon Sundback was granted a patent for the separable fastener, the first pattern for the modern zipper. In commemoration, April 29th is commemorated as National Zipper Day. On April 29, 1927, the custom-built aircraft called the Spirit of St. Louis that would carry Charles Lindbergh on the world's first solo nonstop transatlantic flight was officially completed. On April 29, 1957, the 2-megawatt SM-1 reactor, the first reactor of the Army nuclear program, the subject of another episode of The History Guy, was formally opened to the public. On April 29, 2004, an Oldsmobile Alero was completed at the company's Lansing car assembly plant. It was the last car of some 35 million produced under the brand, which had been in production for 107 years. Before it ended production, Oldsmobile had been America's oldest surviving automobile brand. Natural and man-made disasters never take a day off. On April 29, 1903, in Alberta, Canada, erosion of Turtle Mountain caused some 120 million tons of limestone to collapse in a rockslide so massive that it was heard more than 120 miles away, wiping out a section of the coal mining town of Frank, burying between 70 and 90 of the town's residents. The site of the Frank Slide is today a provincial historical site of Alberta. On April 29, 1952, a Pan American Airways Boeing 377 Stratocruiser crashed southwest of Carolina, Brazil. All 50 passengers and crew were killed in the deadliest accident ever of a Boeing 377. The exact cause was never determined, but it is speculated that the crash was caused when a propeller failure caused an engine to detach. On April 29, 1991, a massive cyclone in the Bay of Bengal made landfall in the South Asian nation of Bangladesh. The massive supercyclone brought winds of over 250 miles per hour and a storm surge of 20 feet. The terrific storm was one of the deadliest cyclones in world history, killing an estimated 138,866 people and leaving 10 million people homeless. As a response, 6 nations, led by the United States, participated in one of the largest ever military disaster relief efforts, called Operation Sea Angel. The operation provided food, water, and medical care, and is credited with saving as many as 200,000 lives. The same day, April 29, 1991, a magnitude 7 earthquake, the largest ever recorded in the Caucasus, struck the province of Raqqa, Georgia, killing 270 people and leaving 100,000 homeless. Aid was hampered by the ongoing conflict between Georgia and its autonomous region of Ossetia. Violence struck the U.S. city of Los Angeles twice on April 29th. On April 29, 1986, an arson caused fire at the Los Angeles Central Library, the main branch of the Los Angeles Public Library System, destroying 20% of the library's holdings, some 400,000 volumes. While one suspect was arrested and then released, the culprit was never identified. On April 29, 1992, anger over the acquittal of 4 officers of the Los Angeles Police Department of charges of the use of excessive force sparked 5 days of unrest and violent riots in south central Los Angeles. Eventually, 10,000 National Guardsmen and 2,000 federal troops were called in to quell the unrest. 63 people were killed in the violence, another 2,383 injured. 3,767 buildings were damaged or looted, resulting in $1 billion in property damage. St. Louis Public Radio explains that the Rodney King riots ignited a national conversation about racial and economic disparity and police use of force that continues today. April 29th has also represented important cultural events. On April 29, 1932, the radio drama One Man's Family debuted on NBC Radio. Little remembered today, when the last show aired on the radio in April of 1959, the drama, centering on the San Francisco family of stockbroker Henry Barber's 3,256th episode, represented the longest-airing, uninterrupted dramatic serial in the history of American radio, although it has been well exceeded by the still continuing British radio soap opera The Archers, more than 20,000 episodes. A similar milestone was reached on April 29, 2018, when the 636th episode of The Simpsons passed up Gunsmoke to become the longest-running primetime scripted American television show in history. In fact, April 29th is associated with a number of long-running shows. On April 29, 1961, the United States was introduced to the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat, with the debut of the Saturday afternoon sports anthology, ABC's Wide World of Sports. The show ran for 37 seasons before the series ended in 1997. April 29, 1968 saw the dawning of the Age of Aquarius, when the Broadway rock musical Hair, with lyrics by Jerome Ragney and James Rideau and music by Galt McDermott, debuted at New York's Biltmore Theater at 261 West 47th Street. The popular musical ran at the Biltmore for 1,750 performances. On April 29, 1967, soul singer Aretha Franklin released her single, Respect, a rearrangement of a song originally written by Otis Redding. The Emmy-winning anthem became Franklin's signature song. In 2018, the song was estimated to have been played on the radio over 7 million times. And in 2021, Rolling Stone magazine listed Franklin's version first among the 500 greatest songs of all time. RESPECT. History occurs every day, but even Pocky agrees that April 29th is full of a surprising number of important historical events. But luckily, we're able to describe exactly how monumental April 29th is as a day in history because of the April 29th, 1852 publication of the first edition of British lexicographer Peter Roget's thesaurus. April 29th is a huge, great, gigantic, enormous, massive, colossal, mammoth, immense, stupendous, tremendous date in history. So much history. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.